In early 2000, I attended my first point guard college basketball camp. Now, I was a basketball junkie. I was known for bringing a notebook to every basketball camp I went to, sitting in the front and taking notes when coaches would talk. So for me, this camp experience was heaven, as part of the time in the camp was spent in a big college lecture hall classroom where we're breaking down film, taking notes, answering questions, and then we would go on the court and we'd practice it and compete, with the things that we had learned. So it's an incredible camp experience for that. But also throughout the camp, there were the threads of these leadership lessons and life lessons that were also backed up by the example and the role models of the coaches there and the camp culture. And that camp culture is so unique. Like every player and coach there, after the first couple attitudes, was bought into getting better, bringing great energy, and being great teammates. I mean, it was incredible to see this happen, like over 100 kids and coaches of all different levels to buy in to what honestly was the most mentally and physically demanding camp experience of my life. As well as personally challenging. Like they challenge you personally within that camp. So two things happened as a result of that week for me, though, as an individual that I want to share. First, it actually helped bring me out of a huge slump I experienced as a player after my junior season in high school. Some of the slump, that slump was self-induced by me being self-absorbed. And I came back my senior year and I outworked every other player on my team, and I started to truly lead. And I credit PGC with that personal transformation. The second effect is I became a coach, I think largely because of my PGC experience. I mean, I still have my notes from that classroom session to this day. And when I started coaching, I started to teach these concepts in the language that I learned at that camp. So in today's conversation, it's the second part of our conversation with PGC CEO Mano Watso. We are going to talk about some of the ways that they create that special culture and experience at PGC camps. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, brought to you by Thrive on Challenge. I'm JP Nurbin, joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. Each week in about 30 minutes, we discuss important principles and strategies of transformational leadership. At Thrive on Challenge, we help coaches to raise the standards and strengthen the relationships in their program because we know this type of culture produces better leaders, better people, and better results. To learn more about how we can help you, go to thriveonchallenge.com, where you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter and get the coaching notes to every episode of this podcast. So Mano, I want to jump into the PGC camp experience, like the experience for the athletes, because it was so transformational for me when I attended. And I was just hoping you could kind of maybe give it a brief overview of your philosophy of what you're trying to create through that week of camp.
Yeah, absolutely. At each one of our courses or camps, externally we call them camps, internally we call them courses. At each one of our camps, the goal is to take the group of players on a journey. And it's on a journey of discovery, it's a journey of change, and it's a journey of learning to see beyond themselves. And one of the things that many players come in, and they don't realize they come in with this perspective. It's only when they leave that they realize, wow, that's been a significant shift or transformation in how I saw my career and how I saw my teammates, my coaches, the game. But they come in rather self-absorbed, rather self-focused. And the funny thing about performance, this isn't just something that's good for players because you're going to be a better teammate. There's a direct tie to performance when you take the pressure off yourself. When you're focused on yourself, it increases the pressure that you place upon yourself. And players just don't tend to play as free when they're so focused on their slump or their stats or how they're impressing or not impressing others. And so at PGC, we attempt to bring players back to the essence of the game. to be present and in the moment, to play for the love of the game, to experience the joy of the game, to focus on learning, to welcome and embrace mistakes and failures, as opposed to getting tripped up by them, to see that as part of the journey and part of the process. And so over the course of the week, this journey that I mentioned, JP, players discover how to see themselves and see their teammates and see adversity and see failures from a different perspective. And I know that's what was so transformational when I attended. I sat in the classroom every single day and just listened to Dick and thought, wow, yes, I've never heard anyone articulate this before, but that's who I want to be. That's what it means to be a point guard. A point guard serves their teammates. Okay, I want to be that type of point guard. This is what it means to be a leader. You have to have tremendous leadership energy. We call it sheepdog leadership. And you have to sheepdog your teammates. And it's like, teach me how. I want to learn how to be that player. This is what it takes to truly think the game. I want to learn that. And so I think it really casts vision for players of who they can be. And at the end of the day, it helps them to not just maximize their potential in terms of their actual performance, but maximize their experience in the game as well. After I left PGC, not only did I feel like a different player, I feel like my experience on the court was much different as well.
Mano, there's two things that I want to get into the weeds a little bit here, and I don't want to get too wonkish or wrapped up in a lot of basketball examples, although you're certainly welcome to use some here. As you know, our audience is made up of coaches from all kinds of different sports and different levels. But I think two of the questions that we get a lot, things that coaches sometimes struggle with when it comes to their practices, builds off of what you just talked about there, and that is teaching mindset. It's one thing to talk about mindset, to talk about having grit and being resilient. And it's another thing, I think, to teach it in a way that it can be received and actionable for athletes. What would you say to coaches that say, I'd love to be able to teach mindset to my team, I just don't really know where to start?
Mm-hmm. So a few different pieces. One is many coaches are strong at giving a pep talk on it. Hey, we need to be this. Or it's something early on in the season, and then they're frustrated because they're not seeing those things come to life. It's a whole nother to weave it into the fabric of your teaching as a coach. And that's what we do at PGC. And that's why so many coaches come attend a 5-day camp in order to learn, how do I actually do this? How do I teach my players to be leaders? How do I help them shift to what I like to call, and what we like to call, a champion's mindset? How do you help to create that, to foster that? How do you help your athletes, regardless of the sport, be more competitive? How do you help them operate with more of a sense of urgency rather than just being lackluster in the practice? So all of those things are things that as coaches we all wrestle with. And so it does begin with a conversation on those things so that players can have an understanding of them. But where players tend to struggle the most is translating them. So they can understand, okay, hustle needs to be an all the time thing. And this is such a clear example of this. We'll talk about it with a group of players just before we go on court in the classroom. And we'll talk about hustle, and then we'll get on court. And the very first thing we do with them, we'll call them over and they walk over. And this is literally 10 minutes after we just talked to them about the importance of hustle, how the best players lead the way with hustle, how if you want to be a great player too, you need to lead with hustle. And then we go on the court and they walk. So that's the missing link. It goes from just hearing it to then helping players to see how it actually translates. So we stop them in the moment, and it's not with ridicule, anger, or frustration. It's bringing it to their awareness. Okay, we talked about hustle, and I just called you in, and then I sent you back out to start the first drill, and some of you walked, many of you jogged, nearly no one ran. Now, let's go back to what we talked about a few minutes ago about hustle. And typically I'll just use a rating system quite often, Nate, to help them understand this. I'll say on a level of 1 to 10, turn to a partner and tell them what your level of hustle was there. 1 being you're nearly dead, and 10 being your all-out best sprint. Go ahead and give somebody your number, 1 being low, 10 being high. All right, everybody just hold up your numbers, with a show of hands right now. Everybody who was 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s, 5s. And then we see the group was at between 3 to 5 on average. All right, is that anywhere close to a championship level of performance with that hustle right there? Let's do it again. And then they go out and they're hustling. And then when I call them back in, then we reinforce it. Did that feel differently? Now you know what championship level hustle is. Now my job as a coach, your job as a coach, is to now uphold that all the time. And when you see it slip, to remind them. You don't have to yell or bark. You simply remind them, and we'll often give them a do-over. We call it do-overs. You're going to get a second opportunity right here to do that over again. So go back to where you were standing. I'm going to call you in again and come in with a level of hustle that we expect for championship performance. So I think the important piece is Nate, to be able to communicate it and communicate it succinctly. And then secondly, to ensure that they understand what you actually are looking for and what it actually feels like for them to do. And then to acknowledge when they do it, and to stop the world and speak to it when it's not being done.
I just love what you're talking about here, because I think, so often coaches might call their players out on those behaviors when they jog over in a much different way early on in the season, and yelling, begging, pleading. And what they do is they end up getting to the middle of the year and they're still doing that. So they just become exhausted, and then just say, all right, I'm tired of begging or asking them. But what you're talking about is equipping, right? Like equipping them with the tools to be aware of their current state, that they're not sprinting, and then to correct that and to give each other feedback or be honest with each other on their own performance, which once again ties back to how you guys approach it as an organization. Which is really, really cool. But I just think you guys are so good at giving players the tools. That's what I think is so exceptional. Players come to your camps and they leave with tools. They don't just experience, they don't just go and hustle for that week. They have these tools to now self-assess and self-correct.
Yeah. And one of the things, JP, along those lines is, as long as you're the one having to stop and give the feedback to your players all the time, you remain as the sole leader. And one of the things that Dick DeVenzio did so well, and then Dina Evans, when she took on Dick's legacy and took the torch, and now what we attempt to continue on as we continue Dick and Dina's legacy, is empowering the players to be influencers of their teammates. And so what does that look like? Well, what it'll often look like at a PGC session is we won't speak to the players that are the stragglers, that are the ones walking. We'll speak to the ones that actually did sprint over, or the ones who are clearly the leaders in the group. And we'll actually raise the standard for them. Hey, that was great, Nate, that you just sprinted over. Did you notice that JP and a few of your teammates didn't sprint over? And what did you do about it? And then we realized Nate hadn't done anything about it. Nate, we need you to be a better leader than that. Now, we're indirectly talking to JP and the other guys that walked over, but we're raising the stakes and we're raising the bar for Nate as the captain or the leader or the influencer. So, Nate, we're going to try this again. We're going to do a do-over, and I want to see you lead. So we're not telling the others they need to sprint in. We're letting Nate know that we expect him to lead. The others are naturally going to sprint in more. They're not going to jog again. But in the process, Nate is going to be turning and encouraging his teammates. Let's go, guys. Hustle in, hustle in. And what you're doing in that moment is you're teaching and training your leaders in what it means to actually lead on the court or on the field or on the rink. And once they do that, and once they take that on, well, you could just continue to raise the bar higher and higher for them and call out others to lead as well. And then you develop a team full of leaders that lead each other.
And that's so effective too, because it also reinforces some of the things we've already talked about of if part of who we are or part of a championship mentality is to hustle or our mistake response, you're embracing the opportunities of failure, the opportunities to teach and to practice in the same way that if somebody was going to the rim and they went off 1 foot instead of 2 feet and you would pause and we'd reflect or we'd have a conversation or we'd ask a question and they would get to try again to improve the skill that is needed in that moment. And I think that's where coaches sometimes either don't recognize those as opportunities. That's where we really learn to be who we want to be. That's where we really reinforce those values of, as you said before, this is what we do around here. This is how we move our bodies around here from place to place. And, I think in our experience, the more intentionality you can catch those moments early in a season or in an off season or in a summer camp, or your open gyms, the less you have to do with those moments as the season goes on. But sometimes it feels like, do I have to stop them every 5 minutes when something, trips my trigger? And again, just knowing what's most important and how you can address those, I think just creates such a tremendous learning opportunity for players.
Yeah. And in fact, we were on a call with all of our directors and some of our new training directors for the summer just earlier this week. And Tyler Costin, who provides leadership to training up all of our directors, walked all of our directors through what do we want to establish in the first 20 minutes of the very first gym session on the very first day. And it goes back to creating the standards and expectations. It's a lot harder if you're trying to establish the standards on day 2, 3, and 4, similar to a coach with a season. If you're trying to establish the standards 1 month into practice, now you're trying to change behavior that's already been solidified in how they show up. And so a lot of times as coaches, we can really focus on what are all the good things we need to introduce in the first few practices of the year. And what I would suggest and highly recommend is that you focus on what are the standards that we want to introduce, not what, but how. And if you get the how right, everything else will begin to fall into place. But if you don't get the how right and you just focus on the what, we need to get these things into place before our first game, you'll spend the entire season trying to raise the bar on the how and trying to close the gap on standards that you never established at the beginning.
That's great stuff. Mano, there's 2 questions I want to ask you before we get out of here, and they are very different. One's really practical here for coaches, and then the other one's a little bit more philosophical that we'll end with. One of the other things I think PGC is so good at is teaching perception. And I don't care if you're coaching football or soccer or tennis or golf or basketball, baseball, what have you. One of the least taught skills and yet most important when it comes to decision making is the ability to perceive information from the environment to make better decisions. And again, without getting into, real deep into the weeds of that, can you just talk a little bit about how you at PGC approach teaching perception to players? Because it's such a valuable skill. And I think one that can be transformational for players as they come through your programs.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've attempted to do is help players identify what are the cues or the clues that would help them to know what decision to make. And of course, this goes for players across and athletes across any sport, but I'll use a very specific basketball example. And I did the same thing for the 8 years that I coached soccer. I took every principle around teaching and coaching and just I had never coached soccer before, but I started coaching 7 or 8 year olds in our little rec league. And I just applied the same principles. Okay, what read do they need to make when they approach a defender and they're going to try and go by them? And I had never really taught that in soccer before, but I just applied the same principle and our players developed their ability to, in a sense, read the defense really quickly. And so you have to identify what are the cues or clues that they need to look for. So if a player is penetrating to the basket in basketball, and how do they know whether they should stop and fake or whether they should go up with it right away off one foot? Very few coaches teach this. I had never learned it anywhere through my entire, not just grade school, not just high school, even my college career. And then coaches would get frustrated that I wasn't making the right decision. And for the most part, nobody else is, generally speaking, either in games. And here's the shocking thing. If you watch layup lines before any game, players are hitting 95% of their layups. And then they get into a game and they hit less than 50%, and coaches are losing their hair. And and the reason for that is, as Nate takes off his hat to to show the lack of hair. Same for me as well. Well, why is that? Because the players haven't learned how to read the defense. So when a player is penetrating to the basket and it's their defender who may or may not try and block their shot, how does the player dribbling the ball know whether to stop and fake or whether to go up and finish right away? The only way to know is to sneak a peek at their defender. But it's not just enough you can sneak a peek, but still not make the right read. So what are the clues that would tell you if the defender is likely to attempt to block the shot? In which case you should stop and fake and get them up in the air. At PGC, we call that an arum. And so the defender flies by and you can finish or get a 3-point play. How do you know? Well, there's a couple telltale signs, and we'll ask any player. We don't give them the answer. They're able to identify that. You see something with their eyes. A defender's eyes kind of light up and get bigger. You see it with their hands. They start to swing their arms back. They're getting ready to jump. You see it with their feet. They start to kind of stagger their footwork and choppy steps as they're trying to time your footwork. If you see any one of those, it's probably a good indication that defender is about to jump. If you see none of those, it's a good indication that you can finish. And so we prep players with what clues to look for. And then we don't just say, oh, go for it. We put them then on court and say, you're going to have a defender. And the defender, the first few times, all we want you to do is show all the clues. And the offensive player is going to make the right decision. Then defender, don't show any of the clues. Offense, make the right decision. And then here's the key part, decision training. It's not just enough to teach your players how to do layups. It's not enough to just put a soccer ball on the feet of your kids and say dribble. No, they have to have the game application. Defender, you're either going to try and block the shot or not. The offensive player has to determine, are the clues being shown or not, and make the read accordingly. And then finally, once they've had some decision training, we say, now you're going to compete. And now, defender, you can try and stop them. Offense, try and score. And if you score, you get the ball back and you can go again, maximum of 3 times. And so that's, I think, one of the ways in which we help players develop their teaching perception.
Well, it's great stuff. And we could sit here and talk about master teaching and how we create learning environments probably for another couple of hours here. And there is one more question that I want to get to, and it comes back to kind of what is at the root, I think, both of your personal mission as a leader, and I think the organizational mission of PGC, which goes beyond just teaching decision-making and finishing, and even mindset and leadership. I think when you do the research on some of the most effective and inspirational and impactful organizations, and I don't care if it's in sports or business or education, they all have something in common. You read Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, there's these level 5 organizations. If you read Tribal Leadership, they talk about these level 5 tribes that have a purpose that is greater than what they do. You and I have had a lot of conversations about this over the years, and I hear at PGC events all the time this phrase of wanting to be a light in the basketball world, and doing that in a lot of ways. One of those ways is with your relationship with the Mully Children's Foundation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the purpose kind of behind all that you're trying to do in terms of reaching coaches and athletes through PGC.
Absolutely. So our overarching purpose is to be a light in the basketball world. And there are so many things that rob players and coaches of their joy in the game and their fulfillment. And unfortunately, so many players and coaches leave the game discouraged, disillusioned, even despairing. And our mission is to be a light and to help bring players and coaches back to the essence of the game, to experience the joy and the fulfillment that can come in the game when they place their focus in the right places. And our mission at PGC is very simple. It's to inspire and equip every player and coach everywhere. We want to inspire them and give them a vision of the career they can have and who they can be and what they can do. And then we equip them with the tools and the mindset needed to be able to live that out. And then even beyond just the game of basketball, we want to be a light in the larger world as well. And of course, as you mentioned, the Mully Children's Family, they're known as the largest family in the world in Kenya, with over 2,000 kids under their care, operating very much like an orphanage, but far more than an orphanage, as a family. And we have been building a gymnasium and spearheaded the building of a 2-court indoor gymnasium. Of course, you've been involved with this work too, Nate. And they're just putting the roof on the gymnasium now, and we're excited to be able to help thousands of kids be able to grow and develop in character and in life through sports and athletics. And so that's going to be taking place very soon in Kenya. But that's all in line with our overarching purpose of being a light.
And Mano, if some of our coaches were just interested in learning more about Key 5 and your coaching community in the basketball world, or a little bit more of the MCF story, where can you send them at the end of this episode?
Yeah, everything can be found at pgcbasketball.com, pgcbasketball.com. And we're on all the different social platforms and YouTube as well, all through PGC Basketball.
Thanks to Mano for coming on the podcast. Be sure to check out PGC. It's not just valuable stuff for basketball coaches. It's valuable for coaches of all sports. Also, if you are new to the podcast, subscribe, not just to get further episodes, but going over to thriveonchallenge.com. There are so many good notes on this episode with Mano. Sometimes we have notes on some things that we've even cut from the episodes. So you can get those notes by being a TOC newsletter subscriber. And to subscribe to the newsletter, it's all over the thriveonchallenge.com homepage, as well as in the details of this episode.